I swallowed my disappointment, took the bucket, left the cabin, and walked along the footpath toward the spring at the head of the ravine. The path led downward along the base of a cliff, winding among boulders big as boxcars, and under tall, stately yellow pines, until it reached a sort of glen or grotto in a deep fold of the mountainside. The air felt cool. The light was green and filtered down in there. I thought of the lion. I knelt by the sandy basin of the spring and drank from my cupped hands before filling the pail. The glen was very quiet. I could hear no breeze, no bird cries, no sound at all except the gentle purr of the water as it glided over moss-covered rocks and sank out of sight into the mud and weeds below the spring. I returned to the cabin, the bucket of water pulling down my arm and shoulder. Grandfather was dishing out the food into tin plates and pouring the coffee. Lee stood near the corral feeding grain to the horses. "Come and get it," Grandfather shouted. To me he said, "Put the water on the stove, Billy, and bring your plate outside. Too hot to eat in here." The three of us sat on the grass against the cabin wall, in the shade, and faced the sunlit world below. We were all silent for a while, and too busy to admire the spectacular view, eating what I thought was probably the best meal I had ever had in my life. Later, after second helpings all around, full and comforted, we set our plates aside and began to talk and look at things again. "How could I forget my cigars?" "Have a tailor-made," Lee said, offering a cigarette to the old man. Grandfather examined the cigarette. "They say women enjoy these things." "That's right," Lee said, "and I enjoy women." He offered his pack to me. "Cigarette, Billy?" I hesitated. I wasn't allowed to smoke, of course. Besides, I preferred the corncob pipe I had hidden in my suitcase back at the ranch house. "Put them back," Grandfather said. "Don't give the boy one of those." "Why not?" "It's a filthy, evil, despicable habit. A disgrace to the human race." Grandfather lit his cigarette and took a deep drag. "He's too young. Put them back." They smoked. I pulled a stem of grass and chewed on it and looked. There was much to look at from where we sat. With the great mountain at our backs, we had a full and open view to the north, east, and south, one half the known world. I could see 4 different mountain systems, not counting the one holding me up, the lights of 2 cities, and about 7,000 square miles of the desert in between. I saw the San Andreas Mountains rolling north, the Sacramento Mountains beyond Alamogordo, 40 miles away to the northeast, the Guadalupe Mountains some 80 miles due east, and the Organ Mountains and the hazy smudge of El Paso far to the south, with the deserts of Chihuahua spreading toward infinity beyond. The sun dropped lower. I saw the shadow of Thieves' Peak creep across the plain toward Grandfather Vogelin's ranch, toward the village of Baker, toward the Guadalupe Mountains, reaching out to meet the curtain of darkness coming toward us from the east. "Grandfather?" "Yes?" "Did you ever climb the mountain?" "What mountain?" "The one above us, Thieves' Mountain." "No, can't say I did, and I never will. This cabin here's high enough for me. About as close to heaven as I ever want to get. You can bury me here." "We'll need dynamite for that," Lee said. "Here lies John Vogelin. Born 40 years too late, died 40 years too soon," Grandfather said. "Why 40 years too soon?" "I figure in 40 years civilization will collapse and everything will be back to normal. I wish I could live to see it." "Why? You'd be right back where you started from." "I'd like that. That's the place to end up." "Don't you want to get ahead?" Lee grinned at me. "I'd rather stay behind. I already got ahead." "You already got a behind where your head ought to be." "Don't confuse me. It took me 70 years to figure this much out. Who's going to water the horses?" Nobody spoke. I stared out at the approaching union of light and dark. Lee and Grandfather stared at me. "Okay," Grandfather said. "We'll try again. Who's going to wash the dishes?" "I'll water the horses," I said. "Fine. If you start right away, you'll still have time to wash the dishes." "I'll light the lamp for you," Lee said, "when you're through watering the horses, so you don't have to wash the dishes in the dark." "Thanks," I said, "but us real cowboys always wash our dishes in the sand." Lee was silent. "Lee, you lose," Grandfather said. "You washed the dishes. The boys whipped you again. Billy, you'll find another old bucket inside the corral." "Why can't I just take the horses down to the spring?" "That boy asks a lot of questions," Lee said. They stared at me hopefully. "All right," I said, "why not? That's all I asked. Wouldn't it be easier to take the horses to the spring than to carry the spring back here to the horses?" "A bucket is lighter than a horse," Lee pointed out. "The horses can walk," I said. "But they're tired. Will you please answer my question?" The old man smiled and patted my knee. "You're right, Billy. It should be easier to do it your way. But the horses don't like it down in there. And the trail is too tight for all three at once. You'd have a rough time. And besides, think what a mess 3 big horses, full of water and grass and grain, would make of one little spring which is barely big enough to dip a pail into. We drink out of that spring, too." "I guess you're right, Grandfather. I should have thought of that." I stood up. "Someday we'll cover the spring. Run a pipe from it down to a water trough the horses can get to." "How long have you been using this place?" Lee asked, winking at me. "How many years, John?" "You shut up and wash your dishes." I walked to the corral, found the bucket, and started down the path to the spring. Lee and the old man rose to their feet, stretching. "We'll give you a hand, Billy," Grandfather said, "as soon as we clean up." "Yes, sir." The twilight was moving in. I had to go carefully to find my way, for the trail seemed awfully vague in the deep shadows under the cliff. When I reached the spring, the tree toads were bleating, a dismal noise and a sure sign of night. There was no other sound except the murmur of the flowing water. A few fireflies twinkled in the gloom above the weeds. The long day in the desert sun had drawn a lot of water from my body. I was thirsty again. I squatted close to the spring, scooped up a double handful of water, and drank. I dipped up more and bathed my face. When the last tinkle of falling drops had died away, I became aware of a deep and unexpected silence. The toads had gone silent, and the water seemed to run more quietly than before. Even the fireflies had disappeared. I waited for a moment, listening to the silence, then reached cautiously for the bucket and dipped it into the water as quietly as I could, afraid to make too much noise. Looking around in all directions, I could see nothing but the damp weeds, the wall of rock, the grand trunks of the yellow pines, the dusky woods. I looked up. I should not have looked up. On the brink of the crag above the spring, I saw a pair of yellow eyes gleaming in a sleek head, saw a dark, powerful shape of unforeseeable hugeness, crouched as if to leap. I could not move. I could not make a sound. I stared up at the lion, and the lion stared down at me. Paralyzed, I squatted by the spring, gripping the water bucket, and unconscious of the ache in my muscles, and waited for death to fall upon me. My grandfather called through the silence from the faraway cabin out of sight and out of reach beyond the twilight. "Billy!" I tried to answer, but my throat was numb. The lion watched me. My grandfather called again. "Billy, where are you?" This time the lion turned his massive head, and with his yellow eyes looked blandly, without curiosity or fear, up the pathway. I heard the old man's boots scraping on the stones of the path, coming toward me, and at last the big cat stirred himself and rose and vanished, all at once, suddenly, with uncanny grace and stillness, into the night in the forest. Grandfather called for me the third time, coming closer, and now I thought I could answer. "Here," I croaked. "I'm here." I managed to stand up, the heavy bucket frozen in my grip. As the old man came toward me down the path, I took a few leaden steps to meet him. He stared at my face. "What happened to you?" I told him. He put one arm around my shaking shoulders, and with his other hand unwrapped my fingers one by one from the handle of the water bucket. Carrying the water himself, he led me up the pathway among the boulders to the cabin, where Lee waited for us in the welcome glow of the lamp. "What's wrong?" Lee said, wiping a tin plate with a bandana. "He saw it." "Saw what?" "The lion." "Ah," said Lee. He looked at me and smiled, his deep eyes tender. "You're a lucky boy." He gripped my arm. "How about a cup of your grandpa's coffee?" "Yes," I said calmly. "I can drink anything." A little later, all three of us went back to the spring, with both buckets, and looked around. Lee even climbed up to the ledge above the spring, but by that time it was too dark to see any tracks. We went back up the trail, watered the horses, built a little squaw fire outside between the cabin and the corral, and unrolled the sleeping bags which the old man kept in the cabin. We sat around the fire for a while after that, watching the moon over the eastern ranges, and talked of the lion, the lost horse, the next day's work, in which Lee announced he would not be able to join. He was leaving us in the morning, but he promised to come back to the ranch in 2 or 3 days. "What does a mountain lion sound like?" I asked. "Well," Grandfather said, "like a woman screaming. How would you describe it, Lee?" Lee considered. "Compadres, a lion does sound something like a woman, like a vampire woman wailing for her demon lover." "Are we going to hunt the lion, Grandfather?" "No, we'll let well enough alone. If we don't hunt him, why, he won't hunt us. Besides, it's the only lion left on the place. I can't afford to lose him." "Do you think he's watching us now?" "I wouldn't be surprised." Nobody said anything for a minute or so. The moon crept up into the stars. I added more sticks to the fire. Grandfather stretched his arms and yawned. "I don't know about you men, but I'm tired. Anybody want to sleep on the cot inside?" Lee grinned. "Is there room for all 3 of us?" "Not with me in the middle, there ain't." "Then let's all sleep out here." "By the fire," I said. "You boys do that," Grandfather said. "But somebody might as well use that cot. I've been sleeping on the ground for about 70 years now, give or take a few." "You ought to be used to it," Lee said. "I'm used to it, but I never did like it much." Picking up his bedroll, the old man walked toward the cabin door. "Good night, gentlemen." "Good night," we said. Lee and I shook the scorpions and black widow spiders out of the sleeping bags, spread them out again on the ground close to the fire, removed our boots and hats, and crawled inside. We did not use our saddles for pillows. A saddle is hard enough just to sit on. At first I lay on my side, gazing at the coals of the burning pine. Then I lay on my back and stared straight up at the marvelous stars, the flaming blue stars. Out in the little park, the horses stumbled around, munching grass, and I heard one of them stalling on the hard ground. A meteor stroked quietly halfway across the sky. "Lee?" "Yes?" "Up there on the peak, was it something like the lion?" He did not answer at once. "Would you mind repeating that question?" "What you found up there, was it something like the lion?" "Oh, yes. Yes, Billy, it was something like the lion." I thought about that as I looked straight up at the stars. The marvelous stars. A marvelous day. The stars became dimmer as I watched them, as if they were drifting farther and farther away from us. I closed my eyes and slept, and dreamed of the missing pony, fireflies, a pair of yellow eyes. "Billy." I opened my eyes. Dark. "Wake up, Billy." I poked my head out of the sleeping bag and for a moment thought I had not slept at all. Then I saw the blue streaks of dawn and the ashes of the fire. I looked toward the cabin and saw the old man already at work by the lamplight, serving breakfast on the table inside the open door. I smelled coffee and bacon. He looked out and called me again. "Out of the sack, let's eat." I struggled out into the chill mountain morning. Shivering, I pulled the cold, stiff boots onto my feet, found my hat, and stood up. Lee was bringing in the horses. Blinking, rubbing my face, I hobbled toward him and helped tie all three near the cabin. My legs and back were so stiff and sore I thought the horses must have spent part of the night tramping on me to keep warm. "How do you feel today, Billy?" Lee Mackey grinned at me in the morning dusk. All those white teeth. No wonder he thought people would vote for him. "I feel pretty good," I said. "Pretty damn good." He laughed and slapped my back. "Come on, let's eat." The old man was banging on the skillet with a big spoon. "Get in here," he hollered, "or I'll throw it to the blue jays." After breakfast, we grained the horses and saddled up. Again, somebody had to go after water. I volunteered. Wanted to prove something. I made 2 trips down to the spring, and the second time climbed the rocks to the place where the lion had been crouching. I could not see any tracks, but I thought I detected a strange odor in the air. A feline smell. No, something else. Ozone and summer lightning. We closed up the cabin, climbed on our horses, and moved out, starting down the ancient trail road toward the foothills. Grandfather and I planned to explore the territory between the mine road and the windmill. Lee would ride with us as far as the junction of the 2 roads. My bones felt like cast iron, my rear like one unanimous saddle sore. But once astride the bulk and power and restless life of Blue, I didn't care. The feel of the reins in my hand, the creak and squeak of leather, the big horse beneath me, gave me all the strength and confidence I needed. I felt like a lion, an aged, battered, but still mighty lion. With joy in my heart and satisfaction in my mind, I rode beside my friends and watched the shoals of green and yellow clouds spread out like burning islands on the sea of the eastern sky. "We'll have rain today," Grandfather said, squinting at the sky through his wise steel-rimmed spectacles. "Not much, naturally, just a thunder shower. About 1/64th of an inch of water and all the thunder and lightning we need." "When?" Lee asked. "Oh, about 1:30. Make it 1:45. I'm going to check that prophecy with the Weather Bureau. If you're wrong, it'll cost you 1 gallon of Bacardi in a wickerwork basket. You've got yourself a bet, young fella. Shake." They shook hands. The nighthawks soared and plunged against the light, aware of the imminent sun. A raven croaked like a witch from a dead pine down below, reminding the nighthawks that their time was almost up. Magpies appeared, hungry birds in academic black and white, who squawked and squalled like quarreling theologians as they gathered. A canyon wren woke up, singing her trickling water song. "Is heaven better than this place?" I asked. "The climate's a little better here," Grandfather answered. "Less humility," Lee said. 3 long switchbacks down through the woods brought us to the joining of the roads and the separation of our little band. "I'm sure sorry I can't stick with you today," Lee said to Grandfather and me. "But I wish you luck. I hope you find that invisible horse." "I have a hunch that horse would be better off if he was invisible," the old man said, scanning the ridges north and east. "You'll find him," Lee said. "Anyway, I'll see you both in a couple of days. Bring Annie along next time." I'll try to do that." Smiling, he gave us a salute, turned his horse, and rode down the trail, through the high, hairy weeds and whiskery flowers thriving among the rocks and faded ruts of the road. I was sorry to see him ride away. Most of the magic I had felt during this expedition seemed to float away with him. I thought of our glorious victory on the day before, and wondered if we'd ever have another like it. Certainly not today. Lee Mackey gave us a final wave and disappeared around the first bend below. "Let's go, Billy." I rode beside my grandfather over the same road Lee and I had taken. The old man apparently shared my mood. He was silent for a long time as we pushed our horses north. I see we had a Jeep in here not too long ago, he finally said. On a one-way trip. I know how they came in. I wonder how they went out.
I didn't say anything.
I hope they found their way out all right. I mean, without coming across any of our livestock. Our gun-happy friends from the other side of the wire seem to have trouble sometimes in distinguishing a beef cow from a wild jackrabbit.
Yes, I said. He looked at me.
You feel all right, Billy?
Yes, sir, I feel fine.
You're not tired, are you? I realize you had a rough day yesterday. All that mileage on a horse after 9 months on your schoolwork.
Honest, Grandfather, I feel fine. I sat up straighter and looked at things sharply, taking an interest. And almost at once I did feel better again.
That's good. We have a lot of ground to cover today.
We covered a lot of ground. We left the old mine road and picked our way through the brush and cactus of the hills below it, following cattle trails, deer paths, and no paths at all. It was hot, sweaty work, with the sun and humidity rising, the dust getting in my teeth and eyes, the juniper branches whipping in my face. All morning we scouted the hills and searched the canyons, working our way gradually downward until, close to noon, we came out on the desert not far from the gathering pen, the windmill, and the big tank full of all that cool, green water. Nothing ever smelled better to me as our tired brutes trotted toward it, picking up their pace. Nothing ever tasted sweeter. Faces dripping, the old man and I smiled at each other and dipped our heads for more. Rocky and Blue did the same, and the flies buzzed happily over us all. Afterwards, we rested in the latticed, inadequate shade of the windmill, chewing on the jerky which the old man brought from his saddlebags. The air was hot and still, the windmill static. Though far off in the desert, we could see the play of the whirlwinds, pillars of dust dancing like ghosts over the plain. While the dust devils played on the lowland, the clouds were piling up on the crest of the mountains, great cumuli-nimbi, charged with lightning and thunder, dark with power and possible rain. The clouds formed, the whirlwinds danced. But the air of the desert remained static as a sea of glass, full of heat and suspense, but inert. Inert, like us. We did not talk. I gazed at the sky and the clouds, and the old man, stretched on the ground with his hat over his face, snored softly in his slumber. I wanted to sleep myself, but I couldn't. A strange excitement kept my nerves alert, and I felt the rapid beating of my heart. Nothing would happen today. The sun would fall over the mountains, the clouds grumble and the buzzards soar, but nothing would happen. I knew that. And to me it seemed all so marvelous. I liked it that way. I wanted no irrelevant event to mar or cut short the crystal stasis of the long, deep desert afternoon. Tonight, perhaps, or tomorrow, but not this day. The clouds spoke in a muted rumble over the barren mountains, and a flicker of lightning, like an illuminated nerve, shot through the tallest of the thunderheads. The roll of thunder faded off, and nothing happened. I rolled over and lay on my belly, pulled a stem of timothy from its casing, chewed on it, and stared at the flies and ants and beetles crawling sluggishly about in the shady weeds at the base of the water tank. A slender, straw-colored scorpion emerged from a crevice beneath a stone, crawling toward a fly. The fly, unaware, was inspecting a fragment of cow dung with his nervous forelegs. The scorpion glided close, the tail with its poison bulb and red curved stinger arched above the head, the big crab claws reaching forward. The fly took off. I killed the scorpion. Not because he was a scorpion, but because he was unlucky. The old man grunted, pushed back his hat, and opened his red-rimmed eyes. He squinted at the sun, high in the western sky, and stood up. I heard the creak of his old joints. "Mount up, Billy. We'll take one more look for that buckskin." Blue stood with drooping neck and closed eyes in the same poor shade of the windmill, shaking his head, twitching his skin, brushing his tail at the idle flies. I saddled him and climbed aboard. With some reluctance, the big horse allowed me to guide him after Grandfather, headed not for home, but for the hills again. We took a different trail this time, one farther to the north and not so steep, that led toward the pass between Thieves Mountain and the San Andreas. As we slowly climbed, I was able to see more and more of the white sands, that sea of milky dunes that stretched for 50 miles north and south between the desert ranges. Lost somewhere in the middle of that vastness were the new installations of the proving grounds. Giant yuccas loomed up in silhouette before the wild sky and the piled-up masses of clouds. We passed a dead pinyon pine, lightning blasted, stripped of all its bark, the nude limbs gleaming like silver. 3 ravens flopped off and lumbered away at our approach, squawking like housewives, alarming the pinyon jays higher on the hillside, who at once set up an answering clamor of their own which sounded like, "Rain, rain, rain!" The thunderheads were closer now, as the trail led up toward the mountains. I saw another scribble of lightning pass through the chasms of the clouds, and after a long pause, heard the barrage of thunder. But the sun rode clear, the vibrant light blazed down. Higher and higher we rode, until we reached the crest of a long ridge in the pinyon juniper belt once more. Here the air was a few degrees cooler, and I felt for the first time the stirring of the troubled air over the mountains. The old man shouted, "Over there!" He pointed toward the slope of the adjacent ridge, half a mile north. "There he is!" I looked hard, but saw nothing alive, saw nothing move except a flight of black wings circling in the sky. My grandfather drew up his horse and waited for me. I stopped near him on the narrow trail and followed with my eyes the line of his arm and forefinger. "You see him, Billy?" I scrutinized the hillside, the tangle of mesquite, yucca, and oak brush, the jumbled boulders dappled with cloud shadows. "No, sir." "Halfway up the hill. See that yellow outcrop?" I stared closely. "Just to the left and a little above it. There's Old Rascal." Then I saw it, the yellowish shape of a horse spread motionless on the ground. "He's down, Grandfather." "He should be. He's dead. Can't you see his belly's torn open? Look, the birds are on him now." This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette.